All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to unit number 3. Unit 3 is land based empires. Today we're going to start with Europe and then we'll progressively move west. I'm sorry, we will progressively move east. We will then see the gunpowder empires of the Middle East, and then we'll go all the way to China and we'll see the Ming and Qing dynasty in China as well. But we'll get to those things on another day. The other thing I want to point out before I move on to our essential questions is that Unit 3 is covering a new time period. We are now in the time period 1450 to 1750. So keep that in mind because Units 1 and 2 were in the time period 1200 1450. Let's go ahead and begin with our essential questions. These are the essential questions for the entire unit. Number 1, how did land empires expand? Think back to Unit 1. In Unit 1, we talked about empires expanding under the Konrad de Maris model. Many of the answers will be the same here in Unit 3. Number 2, what methods did land-based empires use to centralize their rule? Once again, think back to the Konrad de Maris model. Many of the methods that we learned in Unit 1 are going to be the same here in Unit 3 as well. And then number 3, how was religion used to unite and how was it used to divide? We're going to see examples of religious tolerance and religious intolerance. So please keep that in mind and look at the impact that religious tolerance or intolerance have. Sometimes religious tolerance works out really well. Other times it doesn't. Sometimes religious intolerance works out really well. Other times it doesn't. By the end of class today, we should be able to identify the methods used by land empires in Europe to centralize their rule. And we should be able to explain how religion was used to unite and how religion can cause conflicts. We're going to be working on the LEQ in class, so I'll talk about that more during our synchronous session. Let's go ahead and get to our new monarchies. Now, if you'll think back to Unit 1, we saw that Europe was highly decentralized and that lords were challenging the power of the king. And really, the only centralizing force in Europe during this time period was the Catholic Church itself. But then throughout Unit 2, we've seen things start to change a little bit. At the very end of Unit 1, we saw the 100 Years' War. We saw that England and France started to become a little more centralized. But in Unit 2, we saw challenges to the Catholic Church. We saw the bubonic plague and how the Catholic Church failed in its response. We saw how merchants were starting to rise up a bit and challenge the power of the church. Now the kings, the secular leaders, when I say secular leaders, I mean non-religious leaders, so kings and queens. Now they are going to start to challenge the power of the church, and they're going to centralize their power. So the days of the church being the one thing that can centralize every single person in Europe are really out the window. And the days of lords challenging the power of the kings are mostly gone. We'll see a couple examples of lords challenging the power of kings in a little bit, but for the most part, kings and queens are centralizing their power, just like we saw in the other big empires in Unit 1. Our first example is Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Aragon. Now, Queen Isabella was from Castile, Ferdinand's from Aragon. Both of them are in modern day Spain, but before they were married, Ferdinand and Isabella were obviously separate, and so were Castile and Aragon, or Aragon, depending on your pronunciation. When they married, those two societies came together and formed what we now know as Spain. So a couple things I want to point about this is that Queen Isabella is an example of a female leader. So if we're ever given a question on a female who has power in Europe, Queen Isabella is a great example because in fact Castile is larger than Aragon and Queen Isabella has more power than her husband. The second thing I'll point out just a little bit later in more detail is that both of these individuals, Ferdinand and Isabella, are Catholic, and they want to drive out anyone who is not Catholic. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. In England, we have the Tudors. Now, there's this thing called the War of the Roses. We're not going to get into it because it is incredibly confusing. There's a lot of lords who are trying to gain the throne. They're trying to gain power. They're either named Edward, so there's like multiple Edwards who are fighting, and there's multiple Richards who are fighting, and there are multiple Henrys in the picture. There's a lot of names. It's super confusing. If this were AP Euro, we would have to study it. But it's not, so we don't have to study it. What we need to know is that King Henry VII stopped the war by being a Lancaster and marrying his wife from the House of York. That ended the war, and that helped to centralize his power. So instead of having this decentralized society where everyone is trying to get on the throne and trying to get power, now you have a much more centralized society under King Henry VII, who is a Tudor. For those of you who are fans of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones, much of that story is based on the War of the Roses and the Tudors and the Lancasters and the House of York in England. So you understand how confusing Game of Thrones is. That's what the War of Roses is. It's like Game of Thrones, just significantly fewer dragons. The last one is the Valois in France. They were threatened by England during the 100 Years' War, and because people felt threatened, they look towards stability. Whenever people are threatened, they always go with law and order. They always go with some sort of stability, and the Valois in France offered that. So that allowed them to centralize their rule in order to protect the people. So we're seeing a lot more centralization in all of Europe. The other big monarchy, and this is a monarchy that's going to last an incredibly long time, all the way up to Unit 7 with World War I, is the Habsburgs, or the Habsburgs, depending on how you want to pronounce it. The things down here, the closed caption down here, almost had it right. You can spell it Habs or Haps. Either one is fine. So they began in the 11th century and famously held the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Holy Roman Empire, you can think of as modern day Germany. Instead of having this big unified Germanic society, it's broken up into hundreds of different really, really small societies that are all kind of similar to one another because they're all Germanic. So they have an emperor who watches over them. That emperor is actually elected by a very small group of people. So it's not necessarily bloodline. It usually ends up working out that way, is that the next person in the bloodline gets the empire, but you still have to go through the process of actually voting. Now, the Habsburgs are most infamous for their inbreeding, and we'll look at a family tree in a little bit later, and that will shock and appall you because it is just a little odd. But one of the most famous Habsburg is this individual right here, Charles V. So what happened here is that you had the Holy Roman Empire and you had Spain. So Spain was under Ferdinand and Isabella. The Holy Roman Empire was under Maximilian. Once we see the family tree, this will make a lot of sense as well. Their grandson, through different lineages, is Charles V. So when everyone who was before Charles V died and Charles V was finally promoted to be the Holy Roman Emperor, not only was he the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but he was also emperor of Spain and all of Spain's territories, which included parts of Italy and parts of the Netherlands. If this were AP Euro, you would have to know all of that, but you don't. All you need to know is that Charles V is the leader in Spain and in the Holy Roman Empire, and he's an incredibly powerful individual because society has become much more centralized than we saw in Unit 1 when we were looking at European society. Let's talk about some of the methods. So we know that they're centralized. What methods were used? The first one is going to be religion, and specifically, it's going to be the divine right theory. Under the divine right theory, it's actually a very simple idea. God appoints someone to be king, and that's it. The person who is king or queen says, God chose me to be king or queen, and so you have to listen to him. And we see that used by many European monarchs at this time. Now, the Europeans aren't going to be the only ones to use religion. When we get to the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, we'll see that they use religion as well. But you have to keep in mind that these are God-fearing people in Europe. They don't want to mess with the king, because if they mess with the king or queen, they are almost quite literally messing with God, and you certainly don't want to do that. Now, once you have the religious power there, and you get people to identify with you via this very powerful thing called religion, As a monarch, you can kind of do whatever you want. And that's what King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are going to do. They're going to put in place the Spanish Reconquista and the Inquisition. Those two things happen around the same time and are going to be used in conjunction with one another to make Spain fully Catholic. Think back to Unit 1. We talked about the Umayyads and how they brought the Muslim faith to Spain. We saw the architecture that they brought. We saw the culture that they brought. We saw the religion that they brought. Well, now the Catholic King and Queen of Spain don't really like that. And they want to drive the Moors or the Muslims out of Spain. This is very similar to the Crusades. So remember, with the Crusades, there's this idea that Europeans are going to go and attack Muslims in order to take back the land that's supposed to belong to Catholics. Kind of the same idea here with Spain, at least the same mentality. And so they push out the Moors. They finally take southern Spain, which is Granada, in 1492. It is not a coincidence that Columbus sails for Spain in 1492. And we'll talk about that more in Unit 4. But when we do get to Unit 4 and we get to Columbus, you should be remembering the Reconquista and Isabella and Ferdinand because they play an incredibly important role in that. The other part of this was the Inquisition. So once the Moors were driven out, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand needed to ensure that there were no non-Catholics who were still around, because that is how they held their power. As long as everyone's Catholic, everyone's going to obey Isabella and Ferdinand. And so what they would do is that they would inquire about anyone who was deemed Muslim or Jewish. And those non-Catholics would be forced to convert, they would be expelled from the empire, or they would be executed. So any way you look at it, if you're a Muslim or a Jew, it's really bad for you in Spain during this time period. Now, many of these Muslims and many of these Jews are actually going to go to the Ottoman Empire, which is known for its religious tolerance, but we will talk about that when we get to our gunpowder empires. The other big method of centralization is better weapons. We know that there's trading going on via the Silk Road, and we saw that in Unit 2. Well, all of that gunpowder, all of those weapons are coming from the east and have finally made it all the way to the west. Think about that chart that we looked at in Unit 1, that chart that showed all of the Chinese inventions and then when Europeans adopted those inventions. Now is the time the Europeans have finally adopted those inventions. Now, what's going to happen is that these kings and queens are going to work with these merchants. These merchants are the ones who have gained a whole lot of money and a whole lot of power. And these merchants are going to give loans to the kings and queens to allow them to buy guns. Once the kings and queens have guns and cannons and gunpowder, they're going to be able to overpower everyone else. They're going to be able to take land, just as we saw in the Reconquista right here, and they will be able to rule that area. So we need to know that weapons, specifically gunpowder and cannons, are a method of centralization that European monarchs used in order to bring more power to themselves. Now, there's other methods of centralization, and we've actually seen some of these in Unit 1. The first one is going to be taxes. So there's going to be more and more taxes placed on the people. That gives more money to the government, and therefore that makes the government more powerful. But there will also be that expanding bureaucracy. Think about what China had in the Song Dynasty. They had a big bureaucracy. They had a lot of people in their government, and so their government was powerful. In England, there will be the justices of peace. They will carry out the king's laws in the counties of England. So they are almost like police officers in a sense, where they go to these places all across England and just ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing and pay the taxes that they are supposed to pay. France is going to do the same thing. They just call them the intendants instead of the justices of peace. They are to go around and collect taxes from the people all across the big centralized country of France. Now, in addition to taxes and bureaucracy, the kings and queens want to give something to the people. Give might actually be the wrong word in that situation, but they at least want to inspire awe in the people. And so they're going to use large pieces of architecture. Now, there's many examples of this. The most famous one is the Palace of Versailles, which was expanded upon by King Louis XIV, who was known as the Sun King. This is in France. I forgot to put it there, but this is in in France, in case you didn't know Versailles was there. This is a massive palace, and as you see, it's lined with gold. It's got these beautiful chandeliers. You're supposed to see this palace and just be in awe and shocked by how powerful and how rich this king is. And because you're in so much awe, you'll just do whatever the king tells you to do. And that's exactly what the kings want. It helps to centralize their power. So this large architecture is very good at centralizing power. As you can imagine, down the road, people are going to start to get really upset that these kings have all this money to build these massive castles and these massive palaces while people are starving to death. But we're not there yet. We'll get to there when we get to Unit 5. We need to talk about the English Civil War. Once again, I'm going to go over this just very briefly. If this were AP Euro, we would have to know it in detail, but it's not, so we don't, and I'm not going to spend as much time on it. I'm really just going to talk about the major impacts of the English Civil War. So the English Civil War is going to be in the 1640s and to the early 1650s. You have Parliament versus King Charles I. So in France and in Spain, you have this absolute monarchy. And when I say absolute monarchy, I mean the monarch or the king or queen rules everything. Whatever they say goes. Queen Isabella says, we're kicking out all the Moors, then you are kicking out all the Moors. If King Louis XIV of France says, we're going to build a palace at Versailles, then you're going to build a palace at Versailles. You're not going to question it because they are quite literally God. England is a little bit different. They do have a king, but that king is not absolute. That king has his power checked by Parliament in the same way that the president has their power checked by the Congress. The president can't just do whatever he wants because Congress is there. Similar idea here. So many people in Parliament are very much upset with King Charles I because he's acting more and more like a monarch, an absolute monarch, really just doing whatever he wants. And so Oliver Cromwell leads the Commonwealth of England. He actually leads this army to overthrow King Charles I and execute him in 1649. He then attempts to establish a republic government. Before that doesn't really work out for him. So he becomes Lord Protectorate, which is pretty much a king, okay? It's not the word king, but a Lord Protectorate, a dictator, a king. They're really all the same thing. Eventually, people become incredibly upset with Oliver Cromwell. They think he's gone mad with power, and so they want to get rid of him. He actually ends up dying and is replaced by his son very, very briefly until people are sick and tired of all this. They just want to go back to the way things were. And so in 1661, they bring Charles II, who was the son of Charles I, first. They bring him back to England and restore him back to the monarchy. The other big revolution that we need to talk about in England is the Glorious Revolution. So a few years down the road, King James II is on the throne, and he is a Catholic king. As we're going to talk about in our next lesson, we're going to see that England is not Catholic. They have started to become Anglican, and we'll talk about the differences and why that is, as I said, in our next lesson. He also has these ties to France, so people really don't like him at all. Well, his daughter, Mary, had actually married an individual called William of Orange. Orange is actually this place in the Netherlands. William is a Protestant. And so the people in England are sitting there thinking, you know what? Wouldn't it be really cool if we were able to get William and Mary to come back to England where they could be Protestant leaders instead of a Catholic leader? And that's exactly what happens. King James II realizes that his time is up. He leaves and goes to France. William and Mary, invade. I mean, yeah, they come to England, but it's not like they have a massive army that's fighting. They just walk on in and they are declared to be king and queen of England. Now, William is going to sign the Declaration of Rights, which gives Parliament more power and forbids the monarchy from ever becoming Catholic. These two things have three different effects that we should be aware of, and these effects are very long-term effects. One, these two limit the power of the king. So at a time where France and Spain, their kings and queens have more power than they even know what to do with, England's kings don't have that. They are limited. This idea of limiting the power of your king eventually makes its way to what will become the United States of America. This idea that we shouldn't have a leader who is all powerful, that their power should be checked. It should not be unlimited. That's a key part of our Constitution, and that comes from England. Number two, it establishes Protestantism. Instead of being Catholic, they're going to be Protestant, specifically Anglican. Protestant just means you are Christian without being Catholic. Anglican specifically refers to the Church of England. Well, that idea of Protestantism eventually makes its way across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. So why is it that the United States is a majority Protestant nation? Well, it's because of England. And the last thing that we need to know, number three, is that this shows that England has freer political institutions. In societies that are absolute monarchies like France and Spain, there's not much you can do. You're not necessarily that free because you are under the rule of a king or of a queen. But in England, we saw that Parliament and the people at least have a little bit of power. Remember, it's still really, really small. The king still has a lot of power, but it's not unlimited. Because of these freer political institutions, more people are going to feel that they are free to do things that are outside of the norm. They may invent things, they may read books, they may learn about science, they may try their hand at business as well. This is going to be a reason why England is going to be the leader and the beginner of the Industrial Revolution, as we'll talk about in Unit 5. So we see that, yes, all of this is very confusing, but there are long-term impacts. We really need to know that England, unlike Spain and France, is not under absolute rule, and that's going to have profound long-term impacts on their society. That's going to be it for this video here. And then once we are in class, we'll actually use the information from this video to write an LEQ.